Welcome to this lectures edition. This lecture is going to be very short, but it's going to be very precise because I want us to first have an idea of some of the concept that we're going to be meeting as we will be going through our lecture. Firstly, is I want us to understand the broader discipline of archaeology, which is part of history, and I will elaborate as time goes by in this video. What do I mean by that? So, we will look at the origins of humankind, we'll look at the cradle of humankind. All those phenomena are very directly linked to what today we call archaeology, which to some degree in most universities in South Africa is mostly studied under anthropology or studied uh, as archaeology, but under scientists or under environmental scientists. So the bigger question that I think I always want us to look at is that what is archaeology? I remember um, when I started understanding archaeology, I had watched the movie The Mummy. This movie, The Mummy, tells us a tale of a, a mythical archaeologist who goes and ends up meeting some dead bodies that end up hunting him. So The Mummy is it's a very good exemplar of how archaeologist works. But as I'll demonstrate with some of my personal experiences, I hope this video also captures part of that. The following question now is going to be, what does an archaeologist search for? So one of the key elements that as an archaeologist we look for the material left behind, such as an artifact or other activities of human or past human activities. While historians know how to find documents, um, but an archaeologist has a fewer lead where to start to dig. But before I go into deep details about this, I want us to also consider this that these human past activities are very diverse, and that's why I often use the concept of material culture. So, material culture is very crucial in archaeology because it's one that sustains and holds together the concept of archaeology and its objects of research. So maybe the basic definition of material culture could be the study of physical objects that people make or modify and the meaning those objects have for a group of people. Now, let us look at the examples of material culture. That could be clothes, that could be tools, that could be artwork, that could be buildings, that could be weapons, that could be monuments, that could be pottery, but just to name a few. These elements are very important in a sense that they contribute very much into the discipline. And what do I mean when I say into the discipline? I mean that um, every branch of archaeology that branch out to form its own discipline has its own specific object of study. Could it be archaeobotany, it could be geoarchaeology, it could be rock art, it could be um, paleoarchaeology, but at the end of the day, there is a central idea that pushes the material culture as an object of study within that discipline. So now that then gives us, or that now lends us to a second layer of this brief introduction of archaeology. Maybe before I forgot, the picture that you just saw, this is me digging the material remains, whereby we were trying to show students how to excavate, which is mostly one of the techniques that is used in archaeology. So, um, as you've seen, my interest in rock art, well, let me say my interest in archaeology is twofold. One is in human remains, and the other one is in rock art. I mean, as a historian, I'm very much interested in rock art and literacy.
What is material culture in archaeology? If you've ever wondered how archaeologists piece together the lives of people from ancient civilizations, you're about to uncover a fascinating world. Let's explore what material culture is and how it helps us understand our past. Material culture refers to all the physical objects, artifacts, and structures that people created or used in their daily lives. This includes everything from simple tools and pottery to grand monuments and intricate art. These objects are more than just relics. They are windows into the beliefs, values, and way of life of ancient societies. Imagine walking through an archaeological site and finding a piece of pottery. This pottery isn't just a broken piece of clay. It tells us about the people who made it, how they lived, and what they valued. For example, the design on the pottery might reflect their artistic styles, while the material it's made from could indicate their technological capabilities. Archaeologists study these objects in their historical, social, and geographical contexts to understand the cultures associated with them. Context is key here. Finding an obsidian point thousands of miles from its volcanic origin, for instance, suggests that people traded this valuable material over long distances, highlighting their economic and social networks. Material culture also includes the buildings and architectural elements that societies left behind. Ancient settlements, ceremonial burial sites, and even food remains all provide clues about how people lived, interacted, and adapted to their environments. For example, the discovery of ceremonial burial sites can offer insights into religious practices, while the analysis of ancient settlements can reveal patterns of urban planning and agricultural practices. By comparing artifacts from different time periods and geographic regions, archaeologists can trace cultural changes and developments over time. This helps in understanding how technologies evolved, trade networks expanded, and artistic styles changed. Material culture is not just about the objects themselves, but also about the behaviors, norms, and rituals associated with them. It contrasts with symbolic or non-material culture, which includes non-material symbols, beliefs, and social constructs. In essence, material culture is a vital tool for archaeologists to reconstruct and understand ancient societies. It provides a tangible link to the past, allowing us to learn from our ancestors and appreciate the rich heritage they left behind. So, next time you see an ancient artifact, remember it's more than just an old object. It's a piece of history that tells a story about the people who came before us.
So now, since we understand the concept of material culture, I would like us not to very much deal with the scientific part of archaeology, which it's what you will probably see in this picture, whereby I was doing practical archaeology. However, I want us to try and focus ourselves into the works that deals with material culture because they directly link to history. I'm not saying that we're not equipped to deal with issues around scientists, but my focus right now is to move us from the very point of material culture and archaeology to the understanding of how do we even identify key elements that ends up giving us history. So for example, today, or let me say last year, we were celebrating 100 years since there was a discovery of a fossil, the Daung child skull, which was discovered in 1924 by a worker in the quarry mining. Then the professor of anthropology, which sometimes there are a lot of conflict whether he was a very good archaeologist then, Professor Raymond Duart, explained in his writing the following year on the journal, and identified the fossil to have belonged to a 3-year-old child who lived around 2.8 million years ago then. And those fossils were very important because they seem to have shown us who lived at the area at the time, even though it has become the mining site then. But what is important now with this discussion or this point I'm trying to make is that how do we even identify the crackle of humankind using archaeology? And how do we identify the Khoisan and the Khoikhoi descendant communities? Because these are themes that we need to cover. And thus, I wanted us to first be able to identify such vibrant discussions that takes place. And again, and I've said, and I'll also display part of my argument. The archaeology is very broad and it also deals with archives, which I think most people think that it's only historians that deals with archives. But we also deal with the archives, and the archives can be even in a form of rock art, whereby we can look at the drawings, we could look at the engravings, we could look at how the art there itself has been shaped, and then from there we can connect the life of the people who lived there with the current world that we live in, and then we can even try and write down the histories of people that occupied the place, and also look at the cultures, the the ways which people interacted at the place are also evident in this material culture or remains that are left behind.
In the early 1920s, a fossil hunting team from the American Museum of Natural History working in the Gobi Desert was disappointed to report that they discovered dinosaur remains. While most paleontologists would consider this a massive success, to these researchers, the fossils represented a failure because they hadn't been trying to find dinosaurs at all. They'd actually been searching for fossils much closer to home instead, fossils of the earliest humans. And those dinosaurs only showed that they were looking in the wrong place and in the wrong geologic time period. Meanwhile, other people were also hunting for a singular so-called cradle of humankind, everywhere from Europe to the islands of Southeast Asia to imaginary lost continents. And the reason they were all over the map, literally, was because at the time, scientists had no idea where to look for ancient humans. They just had no clue where humanity had begun. And it would take decades before they realized that maybe there wasn't just one cradle. Maybe they'd been asking the wrong question all along. Today, humans are pretty much everywhere, on every single continent worldwide. And this basic fact that we take for granted raises a unique problem. See, when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he predicted that evolution by natural selection would eventually shed light on human history and uncover the details of our origins. But there was no light yet, no fossil evidence of human evolution that was widely recognized. So when it first occurred to scientists to start looking for the fossilized remains of our ancestors, they had to guess where they should look. And they had no hints to go on. Other primates, like chimpanzees and gorillas, for example, are found in more restricted areas, or at least on a single continent, Africa. So a search for the fossils of their ancestors should probably begin in Africa. For orangutans, the same would be true for Asia. But for us, it's messy. Because we're everywhere, the question was wide open. Where did our lineage evolve after diverging from our common ancestor with chimps, which we now know happened about 6 to 7 million years ago? Early on, some scientists theorized that our lineage might have originated in Asia. One German zoologist even hypothesized that humans had evolved on a now sunken continent in the Indian Ocean named Lemuria. This imaginary place stretched from the southeastern shores of Africa toward India and Indonesia to the east, and would have once been connected to land via a land bridge. It was supposed to have been a tropical paradise that would have allowed human ancestors to evolve. But Darwin disagreed. He thought our origins were located in Africa because of our similarities to chimpanzees and gorillas. And in contrast to the paradise idea, some advocates for an African origin argued that actually the harsh environment of South Africa was the catalyst for our ancestors evolving our human-like features, like big brains. Environmental challenges and the presence of dangerous predators, not paradise, led to us. Now, it's worth noting that there were other perspectives on this topic. Many cultures around the world had and still have their own origin stories that differ from the ideas of these early Western scientists. And the Western scientific debates were often built on false assumptions about race and superiority, a problematic theme in the science of human origin that still rears its ugly head even today. The colonial history of this field of science is why local people in Africa and Asia were often deliberately prevented from contributing to the research taking place in their own lands. Instead, they were pushed out by Westerners who centered the debates around their own fossil finds and perspectives. And ultimately, those old-timey guys were just speculating. In fact, Darwin even said it was useless to speculate because a long time had passed since our origins, giving plenty of time for migrations to happen. But others speculated anyway. And by the 1880s, some began acting on those speculations, including a Dutch anatomist, Eugene Dubois, who traveled to Sumatra and Java to hunt for our origins. This search resulted in the Java man fossils, now known as Homo erectus.
And over the next few decades, a series of skulls from the site of Zhoukoudian, China, found by scientists like Pei Wen-zhang, added more evidence for Asia.
But competing discoveries from Africa and even Europe emerging around the same time left the question wide open. It wasn't until the second quarter of the 20th century that fossils started to accumulate to suggest Africa. One of the most important of these is a fossil skull of a juvenile hominin discovered in 1924 in South Africa, dating to around 2.8 million years ago. Known as the Tong Child, the find is among the first early human fossils discovered in Africa, and it helped the idea of an African origin for our lineage become widely accepted by the 1950s. Since then, we've found many other fossils of potential long-lost African relatives dating to either side of the Tong Child on the timeline of human evolution.
For example, now we know about Sahelanthropus, Auroran, and Ardipithecus.
They're all very early potential hominins that date to around or shortly after our divergence from our common ancestor with chimpanzees, some 6 to 7 million years ago. And around 4 million years ago, the genus Australopithecus appears in Africa too, which includes upwards of 8 species and encompasses specimens like the Tong Child as well as the famous Lucy. Many Australopithecines have also been found more recently, including finds nicknamed Lucy's great-grandfather and Lucy's baby. It was this genus that eventually gave rise to our own, Homo, sometime around 2.5 million years ago. And it was members of that genus, specifically Homo erectus, that seem to have first migrated out of Africa by about 2 million years ago, eventually spreading to much of Eurasia. So Darwin, it seems, had been right all along. But while there's been very little doubt for decades now that our lineage and genus both emerged in Africa, the question of where our species emerged proved much harder to pin down. Because earlier members of our genus made it to Eurasia well before we Homo sapiens are thought to have first appeared around 300,000 years ago. So could a population of hominins have birthed our species Homo sapiens in Eurasia rather than Africa? This question was wide open throughout the late 20th century and into the early 21st, with two competing hypotheses taking center stage. One was called the multi-regional hypothesis. And like the name suggests, the basic idea is that after hominins radiated within and beyond Africa, different populations in different places regularly came into contact and interbred. This kept them all very similar by mixing their various traits into the cocktail that we now know as Homo sapiens, which would mean that our species emerged not in one time and place, but gradually across multiple continents. In contrast, the Out of Africa model proposed a very different story. It argued that we can trace our species' origin to a single time and place, somewhere in Africa, only expanding beyond that continent once we were already fully fledged Homo sapiens. The debate over which of these ideas was correct raged for decades, only really becoming clear in the last 30 years or so. The genetic evidence showed that we can, indeed, trace the initial origins of our species to the African continent. For example, it's now well established that the vast majority of human genetic diversity today exists in modern African populations.
And this is telling because it suggests that people who are not African are descended from only a small group of people who left the continent, taking just a fraction of the total human gene pool with them.
Scientists call this a population bottleneck. So in some ways, the Out of Africa hypothesis was correct. But the genetic evidence also shows that when ancient Homo sapiens left Africa, they interbred with our cousins, the Neanderthals and Denisovans in Eurasia. And because the Out of Africa hypothesis originally argued that Homo sapiens replaced other populations rather than interbred with them, this means aspects of the multi-regional model were right too. To make things more interesting, it turns out that the Out of Africa migration around 60 to 80,000 years ago was just one of many, though it was the only one that clearly left direct descendants who are still all over the world. But even knowing that Homo sapiens are from Africa, we are still left with at least one big question. If the cradle of humankind was indeed in Africa, where exactly on the continent was it? After all, it's a vast and ecologically diverse continent, spanning thousands of miles and containing everything from deserts to savannas to rainforests. So where exactly is our childhood home? Well, in just the last few years, scientists have begun to realize that this may be the wrong question altogether. Because a series of recent studies using DNA from both modern and ancient people, as well as archaeological and environmental evidence, have begun to paint a much more complex picture of our African origins. One where we didn't actually evolve in one single population in one single place. Instead, we can trace our emergence to multiple ancient populations that were scattered across Africa. When environmental conditions allowed, they occasionally met up and mixed their genes, all contributing directly to the eventual rise of us modern humans some 300,000 years ago. There was no single cradle. It was a continent-wide playpen. And instead of thinking about our origins like a tree with a single trunk, perhaps the more accurate view is a complex braided stream. An intertwined story of migrations, transitions, and exchanges between various ancient populations that unfolded over vast time and space. No human is an island, and it turns out that this has been the case since our very earliest days. Our friends over at Crash Course have launched a podcast, and if you thought we looked into the ancient past, wait until you listen to what they have in store. The Universe is a new limited series podcast from Crash Course, where Dr. Katie Mack, a theoretical astrophysicist, walks John Green through the history of the entire universe, including the parts that haven't been written yet. Join John and Katie as they discuss the Big Bang, cosmic dawn, black holes, and eventually the end of our universe. It's available now on the Crash Course YouTube channel and wherever podcasts are available. Now, our closest relatives, the Neanderthals, lived in Eurasia for more than 300,000 years. They were expert tool makers, skilled hunters and foragers, and may have even created cave art. So what caused the disappearance of their population? Well, in a way, it could have been us. But maybe not in the way you might have heard. Check out our episode, Why the Paleo Diet Couldn't Save the Neanderthals, to learn more. And thanks to this month's modern eontologists.
Jake Hart, Raphael Hassa, Annie and Eric Higgins, John Davidson Ing, Melanie Lamb Carnevale, Addie, Tony Dye, and Juan M.
You can become an Eonite and help us make the show at patreon.com/eons. And as always, thank you for joining me in the Adam Lowe studio. Subscribe at youtube.com/eons for more evolutionary escapades. When environmental conditions allowed, they occasionally met up and mixed their genes. What a creative way to say doing it.
Now that we have an idea of what seems to be the ins and outs of archaeology, I want us now to turn our attention to the themes that we will cover in this course. So now I want us to focus on the next video that is going to be directly dealing with the homos, which directly speak about the humankind, and that video is only dedicated for that, and simply because I want us to be able to move from the cradle of humankind to cois and to some of the most known heritage sites, in fact world heritage site. And I think you might have probably noticed, partly in the rock art that I did share earlier on, there is a graffiti that I captured when I was doing my research fieldwork back in Bokoni, which is now called Mpumalanga in Lierenberg, Bomblas Farm. And written, um, it's written Marupeng, and Marupeng in Sepedi, the direct translation is where you belong. So these are very interesting times that intersect our own knowledge, whether we speak about rock art or whether we speak about archaeology or we speak about history. But very essential questions that I always think are very necessary for us to ask ourselves are that, what does this concept that we find in rock art has to do with the human past activities that has taken place in an area? So bearing in mind these questions, I think it is very essential that when you go to the following video and when you look at your slides that I've uploaded, you are very conscious and aware of the debates that are out there concerning the material culture, human agency, power, and ideologies, which later then makes us very unique beings. So thank you very much for tuning in into this lecture, and please move forward to the next part of this lecture.